Hey, welcome to part 3 of writing better Scala. In part 2, we discussed about representing application config in which one of the fields was data source, which can take the shape of either, which means it can be either a database or an S3 bucket, so that users can either pass a database related config which involves host, port, username and password, or they can pass S3 bucket, which means they have to pass bucket name and prefix, all nested within data source. The whole application config descriptor was auto-derived using zio-config Magnolia, and we use that in the main function. Like that. I hope you remember all of these bits. Our source looked something like that, which is a flattened config source representing system environment in which nestedness was represented using a delimiter underscore. We talk about that delimiter in defining our config source. All right. So this was our source. Val source is equal to config source from system environment from map, and then we say that, and config source is of the type config source. All right, now let's move from this flattened structure to JSON in this session. I think I have got a copy paste of a JSON source. I think that's the one. Yeah, it's exactly the same. Within data source, I have a host, port, username and password instead of bucket name and prefix, which is representing S3 bucket. This is database. And this is no more valid. Instead, we use type safe config source, which is part of zio-config. You need to bring in zio-config type safe to make use of JSON in your config. From hocon string, for those who are not familiar with hocon, consider that as a superset of JSON, and we pass this JSON source. Now this complains, this says, hey, this is no more a config source. Instead, I can only return either a reader of string or a config source. This indicates that this thing can fail, and we are going to represent that in types using either. So why does it fail? Probably due to the malformed JSON, it can fail. And you know how to unwrap this. So we don't need to be scared when an API returns an either. Developers often complain, so why is it returning an either? It's going to make it really hard for the users. Maybe, but end of the day in Scala, you have for comprehension to unwrap everything. Yield something, and here our source is not exactly source, but source either, isn't it? This is not going to work anymore. So our real source, we are unwrapping it from source either, and our real application config is read application config, which is the descriptor from that takes the config source and then we can choose to return application config as it is, so that will give you application config, but we can also run our business logic straight into this for comprehension. As soon as we unwrapped application config, we can choose to run the business logic, although run is really silly because it returns unit. And let's print this config result. So you can see, using the same config descriptor, now it works with a different source. It was a flattened system environment or constant map before. Now it is a proper nested JSON string. You can also grab it from a file, and zio-config has things like from hocon file, and you can pass a file if you need. Anyway, you can see the level of abstraction here. Using the same program, you can now read it from JSON source. Let's run this. And our application config is left of database and a region, which is optional. Really easy. Now the next step is to add one more source into this data source. What if our ETL framework also supports Kafka topics? For those who are not familiar with Kafka topics, consider that as a third source. So let's say Kafka, and I have a topic name and brokers. Again, don't worry about these terminologies, these field names. What we really want is a third source, and you can't do that, right? Like, you can only do that, as you can imagine. So this is when we are simply using either itself to represent this particular business logic, which is fair enough, but things get complicated if we have a fourth source that also takes a host and port as a field name. You can see a sort of conflict happens, and zio-config is going to handle such scenarios, but then you have to guess things a lot. But for the time being, we don't have any conflicts. For the same reason, we will just go with either with this pattern. Okay, so it tries to parse whether all of these fields exist, or whether these two fields exist, or whether these two fields exist. No changes in here because we are using auto derivation. So the description of that entire application config is not going to change. In this case, it should be parsed as a database. Now, zio-config is one of the very few libraries that sees either in this way, right? So auto derivation for either means I'm going to parse all of it, and then I'm going to pick the one that succeeds. Now, what happens if I skip that? This means none of them is going to be retrieved. Database is not going to be retrieved because something is missing. Port is missing. S3 bucket is not going to be retrieved because these two fields don't exist. Kafka is not going to be retrieved because brokers and topic name doesn't exist within the nested field data source. Okay, now this hence should produce an error message. Now this error message may look verbose, but it's detailed and it's going to be useful. Remember that every branch you may have one or more errors. If there are and you have to fix at least one error in each branch. So let's take the first branch, which means this parent branch that consists of 3 errors, of which the first error has only one branch, and we have only one error in that branch, which means pass the port and you're good to go. Or you can also choose to do something else. You can fix the second error. The second error itself has 2 branches, and each of those branches have exactly one error message, which means you have to fix both these missing values to fix that error message. That will involve prefix and bucket name representing S3 bucket. Data source dot means nested under data source field. Or you can choose the third way, fix this error message, which means passing the topic name and brokers. So out of these 3 OR logic error message, we are going to go with port, and that will fix that error message. And we have seen the results before. Simple. Now, using this application config data source in the core logic is going to be a little tedious now, because application config data source has a nested left-in value. So this value is of the type database, and this value is of the type bucket, either a bucket or a Kafka. So you need to do further pattern match to unwrap S3 bucket and Kafka. So this is of the type S3 bucket, this is of the type Kafka, the first one is of the type database. Okay, just to print them out. Now, end of the day, this is complex. And if we have one more config, this is going to get really tedious and less readable. And along with this, there is one more problem. This means the conflict which I was talking about. What if I have a source, a fourth source that has got exactly two fields like host and port, and which one zio-config is going to work with? So there is a bit of uncertainty there. So we need some way of representing, hey, this is about database. And within database, I have these four fields. Now this is much more safer way of doing it. And the way you can achieve this is by using ADTs. Remember, ADTs has nothing to do with that naming in between. ADTs is a better way of representing this logic, which is much more scalable. What is an ADT? Algebraic data type. Now we are going into some of the concepts of programming within the Scala paradigm, Scala or Haskell for that matter. So the way we encode ADTs is like that. I have a type called data source, and instead of this nested either, I simply give data source, and all of these sources extends data source. That's it. Again, nothing has changed. But in this case, zio-config's default behavior when it comes to data source is that you need to represent one of these types under the field data source, and then you have to also specify what type exactly it is to avoid conflicts. That would mean a representation like that. It says my data within my data source is of the type database, and hence I have to pass all of those four fields. If I have a fourth source, which is database 2, having the same field names, it's fine because my type name is saving me from conflicts. All right, and let's run this bit. And that's going to complain because it's no more either of left and right. Instead, we have a much more readable handling of data source. So println, it's a database. It's a S3 bucket. And that's a Kafka. Maybe we can put Broca's topic name, S3 bucket, bucket name, and prefix. And database, maybe you can choose to just print out the database as a whole. Database. Since we are not using it, the best way to represent the fact that we are not using it is underscore, something that is missing in Java. If you're familiar with doing this kind of logic in Java, it's really tedious. And it's just impossible in Python. As far as I know, all this error accumulation and all this representation of your business logic using types, definitely it's not there in Python. And in Java, you have certain things, but not quite ergonomic as Scala. That's it. That's all about ADTs. Now remember that you have to give it the name of the type when it comes to ADTs in your config, which makes sense, but that's it. You can customize this behavior. You can choose to skip this one, but you just need to let zio-config know that, hey, don't try to expect something in between data source and the actual parameters, although I wouldn't recommend it. And you can also choose to do something like that, which libraries like pure config works with that format. And skip that one. Pure config is another great library to retrieve config, and it has got many of the features which I have been talking about with respect to zio-config. But in pure config, you need to give that representation. zio-config also work with that representation, but you just need to let the auto derivation know that, hey, have this structure. We will talk about all of that in the next session. I hope this was useful. Remember that ADTs is not part of config retrieval. ADTs is a much more important general concept, and I hope for those who are not familiar with ADTs, this is like a quick intro to algebraic data types for you. I hope the session was useful. If so, please like and subscribe. See you in the next session.